The German officer stops speaking. He is holding a captured American map that shows the anti-tank ditch his men dug back in May, the ammunition dump concealed under the railway embankment, the machine gun position tucked into the second-story window of the schoolhouse, the fuel cache hidden beneath cut brush. Every defensive position he has personally spent 4 months building. American forces entered this village yesterday. The map in front of him was printed almost a year ago. He looks up at the interrogator. Quietly, he asks who provided this. He believes there must be a traitor inside his own command. It is the only explanation his training will allow him to reach. The American captain shakes his head. Nobody, he says, provided anything. The map was printed by a young woman in Maryland who has never left the state. The officer does not believe him. For the rest of his life he will never believe him. And the strangest part of what he is about to be told is that the captain is telling him the exact truth. The same scene, with small variations, repeated itself hundreds of times between 1943 and 1945. In Tunisia, in Sicily, across the hedgerows of Normandy, German officers taken prisoner reached, again and again, for the same word to describe the American maps recovered on their persons. Rätselhaft, baffling, not simply difficult to explain, beyond the categories they had been trained to think inside. These were not sloppy generals. Most had been educated at the Kriegsakademie, and when they were shown captured American cartography and asked, plainly, how it could exist, they had no answer. They guessed at spy rings, at treason, at hidden facilities in the American desert. None of it was correct. Every one of them was searching for a concealed headquarters, an elite unit somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic, where the impossible maps must have been produced. It did not occur to any of them that the reason they could not find a secret center was that no such center existed. What the Americans had built was something a German officer, in 1944, was almost incapable of seeing. To understand why, you have to start not with the war at all, but with a single sentence, buried inside a bureaucratic decree, signed in Berlin in 1936. That summer, the German government created a unified national mapping authority, the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme. Publicly, it was framed as housekeeping. For decades, individual German states had each used their own coordinate systems and scales. Now, at last, cartography would be standardized. But the founding document contains one clause that, in hindsight, decides almost everything that follows. Map-making, it says, would be placed directly under military command. To a civil servant reading that line in 1936, it looked like tidy administration. To anyone trying to explain, a decade later, why German officers could not decipher a captured American map, it is the seed of the entire catastrophe. From that moment on, in Germany, maps were state secrets. Cartographers were uniformed officers. A geographer, intending to travel abroad, required security clearance. German military attachés in Rome or Paris were quietly tasked with buying tourist atlases from local bookshops and forwarding them home. Purchasing a guidebook to Tuscany was, quite literally, intelligence work. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, cartography was a hobby. The United States Geological Survey sold detailed topographic sheets to the general public for 30 cents apiece. The National Geographic Society employed dozens of working cartographers and published atlases anyone could pick up in a bookstore. University geography departments sent professors on foreign field trips and brought back the data in personal notebooks. When the Tennessee Valley Authority needed topographic sheets of 7 states, they hired civilian contractors, who did the job using a borrowed piece of German optical equipment. To a German intelligence officer surveying this landscape, none of it looked like a system. It looked like chaos, no central authority, no security control. Civilians wandering around with cameras and notebooks. It did not read, to trained German eyes, as a serious national cartographic capacity. It was in fact an entirely different kind of system, one the Germans had no framework to recognize. By 1942, when the United States finally consolidated all of that scattered civilian expertise under a single new agency called the Army Map Service, the founding instructions were, by any conventional military standard, strange. Build the workforce out of civilians. Women, specifically, because most American men of draft age were already gone. Hire them, train them, put them at drafting tables for 12 hours a day. The new headquarters was a purpose-built facility in Brookmont, Maryland, 4 miles northwest of Washington. By mid-war, it employed thousands of working cartographers, the majority of them women. Almost none had ever made a military map before 1942. Most had never made a map of any kind. They were school teachers, librarians, secretaries, recent graduates who a year earlier had been studying English literature or fine art. 8 weeks of training. That was the crash course. 6 months later, the finished output of their drafting tables was in the hands of infantrymen on 3 separate continents. They called themselves, informally, the Military Mapping Maidens. Teams specialized. One did road networks, one did railroads, one did elevation contours, one did coastlines. Each team assembled its piece of a map of a place none of them had ever visited. That particular working method is the piece German officers could not process. Inside the German professional tradition, map-making meant fieldwork. You physically traveled to the site. You surveyed it. You measured elevations with your own theodolite. Only after standing on the actual ground did you sit down and draw the map. The map was, by definition, a product of physical presence at the location. The idea that a 23-year-old former librarian, sitting at a drafting table in suburban Maryland, could produce an accurate topographic map of a Belgian village she had never visited and could not have located on a blank globe, that was not a proposition a German general's training allowed him to seriously entertain. It read as nonsense, a violation of cartography's basic logic. And yet she was doing exactly that. Not once, not by accident, thousands of times. And the maps were accurate enough, consistently, that entire infantry battalions bet their lives on the details inside them, which raises the obvious question. Where was the underlying data coming from? The answer lived at 30,000 feet, in an aircraft that carried no guns. The F-5 was a reconnaissance variant of the P-38 Lightning. Its nose and belly were fitted with cameras. It had no machine guns, no cannon, nothing for self-defense. The pilot's entire job was to fly straight and level over occupied territory, trigger the cameras and, with luck, come home. By 1944, F-5 pilots over Europe were routinely flying above 25,000 feet, often without fighter escort. The camera system was called the Trimetrogon, 3 cameras firing at the same instant. One aimed straight down, the other 2 angled outward 60 degrees to either side. In a single exposure, the aircraft captured everything visible from horizon to horizon, perpendicular to its flight path. A single mission photographed a strip of ground roughly 100 miles wide. Multiply that by hundreds of aircraft, multiply that by thousands of sorties, multiply across 4 years. The result was a continuous, systematic photographic survey of Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Nothing else on Earth resembled it. The German Luftwaffe ran its own reconnaissance program. It was competent. Its Zeiss lenses, in some cases, outperformed anything the Americans could build. This was never a story about better cameras. It was a story about scale. The Luftwaffe took photographs on demand, for specific missions. The Army Map Service was quietly building a photographic record of entire continents. Those millions of accumulated photographs then fed into a machine almost nobody outside the specialist community had heard of, then or since. The multiplex projector. Picture a darkened room. On a large lit table, a stereoscopic image appears to float in mid-air. Hills rise. Ridgelines run. Buildings visibly stand up from the ground. The operator wears simple red and blue glasses, one color for each eye. A small floating cross hovers over the projected model. She turns a control wheel. The instant the cross seems to touch the ground of the floating landscape, she records the elevation. The machine writes the number onto paper below. Move the cross. Touch the ground. Record. Hour after hour. Day after day. The topography of land thousands of miles away emerges onto paper, one measured point at a time. Here is the irony that would come to haunt the German officers under interrogation in 1945. The multiplex projector was a German invention. Carl Zeiss developed it in the early 1930s. American engineers began importing the technology in 1934. By 1938, a firm in Rochester, New York, was manufacturing American-built copies for ordinary civilian use. By the war's end, multiplex stations were running around the clock at the Geological Survey, the Tennessee Valley Authority, engineering schools, and the Army Map Service. Germany, the country that invented the machine, built no more than a handful across the whole war. Everyone kept under tight military control. By 1944, American operators, most of them women, working rotating shifts around the clock, were routinely extracting three-dimensional terrain data from photographs of ground no American had ever stood on. A stereo pair of aerial images of a Norman village, projected through the machine, produced a working topographic map, accurate to within a few feet. Every barn, every drainage ditch, every property line. This is where captured German officers, at interrogation, tended to break down. They understood aerial photography. They understood captured maps. What they could not account for was the inclusion of data that should, by any conventional logic, have required a human being standing on the exact ground. That data existed. It came from somewhere. And the answer is the strangest part of the whole story. Some of it, a great deal of it in the end, came from a small number of men who swam ashore in the dark. They were called Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, COPs, a British-run specialist unit based at a sailing club on England's south coast. A few dozen volunteers, trained as combat swimmers. On New Year's Eve, 1943, two of them slipped over the side of a landing craft roughly 300 meters off what would become Gold Beach. Major Logan Scott Bowden, 24, a Royal Engineer, Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, 25. They carried metal soil augers and waterproof sample tubes. They swam in through the winter surf, under the noses of German sentries patrolling the seawall above them. They took core samples of the sand. They measured the beach gradient by hand. They documented every visible obstacle. Then they swam back out to the waiting boat. Records show the two men returned to the Normandy coast more than 30 times before D-Day, sometimes by landing craft, sometimes by submarine, sometimes swimming in alone, a folded piece of waxed paper tucked inside a wetsuit, carrying out sand collected in the dark. When American planners heard about the operation, they requested the same team survey the American beaches. In January 1944, the same two men landed twice on what would become Omaha. The samples confirmed what preliminary geological work had already suggested, that portions of the visible sand were, in fact, thin crusts sitting over soft peat. Peat that would not support the weight of a 30-ton tank. That finding, extracted grain by two men in cold water at night, changed the invasion plan. Engineers developed specialized bobbin tanks, vehicles that unrolled a flexible reinforced carpet across soft ground so following armor could cross safely. That sand, those samples, those measurements went directly into the maps carried ashore on June 6, 1944. The chart used by U.S. Navy Beachmaster Lieutenant Commander Joseph Vaghi at Colleville-sur-Mer on D-Day, preserved today in the Library of Congress, shows beach gradients accurate to within inches, tide stages by the hour, bearing capacity of the underlying substrate. The German beach obstacles, complete with their exact spacing, measured depth and angle of implantation. The German garrison at Omaha had built every one of those obstacles with their own hands. They believed the placement was a closely guarded secret. They watched their beach every day. They never saw the two men who had swum through the surf in the dark and measured what they had built. After the beachhead was secured, Allied intelligence teams worked through captured German command bunkers along the Atlantic Wall and recovered the German maps of the same beaches. Those maps showed the obstacles. Of course they did. Germans built them. But they did not show the gradients. They did not show the substrate. They did not show tide stages calculated to the hour. The German garrison knew the surface of its own ground. It did not possess data about that ground that, in a real sense, it had never bothered to collect. Step back and consider the whole picture from the seat of a German staff officer in the winter of 1945, the war already lost, working from captured American maps, prisoner interrogations, and every scrap his own cartographic service had pieced together. Trained inside a doctrine of unified state authority over every intelligence function, he would reach the only conclusion his framework allowed. The Americans must have built a secret organization, enormous and concealed, staffed by elite cartographers and supported by a spy network reaching into every corner of Europe. The fact that Reich intelligence had missed it for years must indicate treason inside the German command itself. He would be wrong on every count, and according to the surviving interrogation records, he would nevertheless be very close to what most captured German officers actually concluded. What none of them could see was that there was no secret to find. The system had produced its maps roughly the way Henry Ford's plants produced automobiles, through coordinated assembly and the patient distributed labor of tens of thousands of ordinary people, each performing a narrowly defined task. These were officers who had spent their careers thinking of cartography as an art form practiced by a small number of specialists under tight central control. They could not perceive a system built on the opposite principle, deliberately decentralized, staffed mostly by civilians, producing finished output in volumes measured in the hundreds of millions of sheets. The map was visible. The network that made it was not. There is a deeper lesson buried inside all of this, and it is not really about maps. The German officers had been raised inside a tradition that treated expertise as inherently rare, properly kept under state control. The Americans had built something running on the opposite principle. They had extended real trust to ordinary people to do work that mattered. A former librarian, trusted to learn cartography in 8 weeks and then produce maps infantry battalions would bet their lives on. A 23-year-old former art student, trusted alone at a drafting table to simply do the job right, unsupervised, day after day. If you had been the German officer at that table in 1944, staring at a map of your own position that should not exist, would you have been able to guess the truth? Or does the answer only look obvious now, once someone has walked you slowly through every piece of it in order? The captured maps carried a lesson that was never really technological. It was civilizational, and it would take a full post-war generation of German military historians even to begin describing what their own predecessors had spent an entire war staring directly at without once managing to see.